Hello and welcome to another Literacy Ready training refresher. This training refresher is for English Unit 1, Lesson 7, and it focuses on drafting the synthesis essay. So this draft of the synthesis essay is what the unit has been leading up to. So in activities 1 through 4 of this lesson, students will draw on the work they have done throughout the previous lessons in the unit to work through the writing process and ultimately produce a draft of their synthesis essay. So in activities 1 through 4, there's a lot of the writing process embedded here. And that includes revisiting the assignment prompt and the quotes. Students have already been introduced to that earlier in the unit, but we go back to it again just to make sure everyone's clear on it. Revisiting and possibly adjusting the timeline for their work that they created in Lesson 3. So we'll go back to that timeline, see what the due date is, look at, if necessary, adjusting that timeline. They'll also be reviewing potential source material from their academic notebook. So this means going back through the academic notebook for all of the writing that they've done in reading logs and other kinds of writing, rhetorical précis, and looking for material that they might be able to use as evidence for their synthesis essay. In addition, students will see if there are holes in their source material, and they'll look for new source material as necessary, write a summary paragraph for their essay and an outline, and then write a draft. So a few things that teachers should take into consideration as they're working through this part of Lesson 7. First of all, the time that your students need, both in class and out of class, may be different from what we've estimated in the lesson plans. So if your students need more time or they need less time, you should, of course, be as responsive to them as you can be and not worry too much about fitting into the particular time frame that we've got for as estimates for how much time it might take for students to do this work. In addition, all of students' preparatory work up to writing the draft is done in the academic notebook. So they're still working through their academic notebook until they write the draft, and then they write the draft on their own. I think it's important too that you emphasize for students that they are working up to a draft and that they will be receiving feedback on that draft and they will be making changes to that draft after they get their feedback. By this time in the unit, it's most likely that students will have focused in on a specific quote from the prompt that they want to write to. They will have a particular stance that they want to take, either pro or con for that quote. There may be a few students who are still trying to decide, and that's an important decision for them to make based on the evidence that they've found. In addition, you will need to make sure that you provide time for your students for the planning work. So reviewing the timeline and adjusting based on the due date, that's an important piece that needs to be included in your class, and I would really encourage you not to leave that out, just so that students are thinking about what it takes to get writing like this done, and maybe that will transfer a little better into their college settings. And then you want to model for them the process of reviewing the academic notebook for materials. So in the lesson plan, it talks about modeling that process by taking a student's academic notebook, putting it up on the document camera, and sort of modeling, reading through it, and looking for a match between the particular quote and that particular set of materials. So my recommendation would be that you choose the student carefully, that you use their academic notebook. So it should be someone who's got a pretty good set of materials, but at the same time you don't want it to be perfect, because it's important for students to be able to see that if there are holes, if there are disconnects, then they need to be able to go and find some more materials. Once you're finished modeling that for students, it really is important to provide time for the reflective work for students of seeing what's still needed. What holes are there in the material, and where might they find additional sources? So what we do in the lesson plan is we ask students to share where they are with each other. This is an opportunity to check in individually with students, and I don't think it's a bad thing to do to sort of just go around the room and ask everyone to say, how much do you have in terms of source material or evidence? what kinds of things do you still need, where might you get those things, and it will give all of the students the opportunity to see that they are not alone in perhaps having holes in their material and needing additional sources. There's a list of additional sources that's provided in the lesson plan. You can certainly use that list of additional sources if you want. And then it's easy for students to find additional sources either online or in your school library as necessary. So again, that's going to be a place where the time may be different for each teacher and for each student depending on what they've been able to get and how adept they are at finding additional information. Eventually, in this set of activities, students will come to the point where they're asked to draft a summary paragraph. So a couple of things to remember about this. First of all, it's important for you to remember and for your students to remember that this is a draft. It doesn't have to be perfect. It needs to sort of lay out what the thesis statement is and what the evidence is to support it. It may be that your students will need some work on writing a thesis statement. We don't provide a whole lot of support for that, but the likelihood is that students will have some experience with writing a thesis statement from their English classes. You might need to do a brief mini lesson or some other kind of work to help them with putting their argument or their synthesis point into a thesis statement. You might also talk with your students about how the summary paragraph is similar to or different from the rhetorical précis. In some senses, it's similar in the sense that it provides a summary, but in others it's different because we're not asking them to look at obviously something that's already written, but just to sort of take a stab at what's going to be the content of the essay. And then you might want to show them some samples of abstracts, which would be the closest thing to the summary paragraph that they might be able to find. There's a website here that might be helpful to you. You can take a look at that. I think the key thing to remember here is that it's a draft of a summary. If it ends up changing, that's okay. It's just a way for them to get the content planned out ahead of time before they start writing it. Next, students will be creating an outline. They'll do this outline in the academic notebook, and it's important that you remember that they should be focusing on content over form. So the form that's in the academic notebook for the outline is fairly loose, and students can revise it if they want. The key is to get the content down in the outline, and again, to remember that it's a draft, and it should provide a structure but not be a concrete, immovable structure that can't be changed. So at this point, students have written their summary paragraph, they've written their outline, they're ready to start drafting. The drafting is going to take place outside of the academic notebook. So it could be on paper, it could be on a computer, whatever. One thing that I found to be very helpful with my students is to write the word draft, rough draft, horrible draft, whatever you want at the top of the paper. I think it gives students sort of permission to get something down on the paper without having to worry about being perfect. Another recommendation I would make is that they start with their body paragraphs, and once they've finished their body, it's often easier to write the introduction and the conclusion paragraphs. Speaking of paragraphs, it's important too that you work with them, perhaps one-on-one conferring with them regarding paragraphing. That's sometimes an issue for students, that they are not clear on where to separate into paragraphs. They also may need some support on embedding quotes and other evidence. And what we would expect here is that they're doing a mix of in-class and at-home writing. Again, it's a draft, and so although you want it to be as high quality as possible in terms of content and structure, this is a place for them to not have to worry about perfection in their use of standard English, in their punctuation and embedding quotes and other evidence, and their citations. So if they get a rough draft finished, then we'll still have opportunities for peer editing and teacher feedback to help them revise and edit for the final draft later. Right now, the focus is on just getting the draft completed. When students have finished their rough drafts, the next thing that's going to happen is that they will use their thesis and their evidence to create and deliver a presentation. There's some information about that provided in on this iTunes U training refresher site. And then the teacher gets ready to provide feedback on the rough draft aimed at the final draft.